I'm glad to be continuing this series that we've been in that's going to really culminate in 2 weeks. We call it the People of Easter. And where this really comes from is we just really believe in the idea of, hey, the more we know about the people that surrounded the events of Easter, the more we can know about Jesus. And what's important about even kind of that phrasing and how we say that is we're going to learn about Pilate today, but the focus isn't Pilate. The focus is to learn about Pilate so we can learn more about Jesus, because Jesus is the focus. He is the point. And so that's what we're going to be looking at. It made me think about a quote that I remember hearing recently by a great philosopher by the name of Ted Lasso. Have you ever heard of that? He has this quote where he says, "Man, I love meeting people's mothers because it's like reading an instruction manual onto why they're crazy." So it's a funny quote to help us, when we understand kind of meeting people and understanding other people in your lives, man, it helps you understand a lot more about them. I saw this for example, practically yesterday. My wife, for the very first time, watched Good Will Hunting. A movie came out in 1997. If you haven't seen the movie, you've had 26 years. So here's some spoilers. But in this movie, you have this super genius. And you have this mathematician, this professor, and he gets so upset because he's not making any of the decisions that he would make if he was that smart. And he gets so frustrated with him, and then as the movie progresses, you find out more about his life, and you find out that this guy, Will Hunting, was abused in the foster care system. Everybody that he thought he'd ever loved and cared for has left him. And understanding that, we begin to understand why he makes the decisions that he makes. Why that he only has 3 friends in this entire world, and they're degenerates and make just poor decisions throughout the movie, and so that moves him. And he's like, man, these are the only people that has ever cared about me. So I'm just going to follow these guys. So understanding kind of the people around help you understand the person, and that's true about us. It's true about everybody, and that's true about Jesus in this story. So that's why we're in this story and why we're looking at a particular person. But one of the things that's interesting is when you learn about people and how that affects their decision making. Because there's a lot of decisions that to some people that would be very easy, to others that would be very difficult. For example, this is a very polarizing one, like picking where to go for dinner. Right, so for some people, that's like an easy decision. The first thing that comes to their mind, that's it. For other people, that is a very taxing decision. It's like, man, please don't ever make me pick that. And you're like, all right, I'll pick it, and then it'll still be wrong, right? That's kind of what happens in our house, at least. Not pointing any fingers, but it's funny how some decisions can be very easy for some and very difficult for others. I saw a video recently. A man had a briefcase full of money. And he went to a dog park, and he was offering people $100,000 for their dog. And he didn't get a single taker. Not a single taker. I asked Miles this morning. Miles doesn't have a dog, but I asked him this morning. I said, hey, if somebody offered you $100,000 for your dog if you had one. He said, man, I'd do it for like $10 and a pack of gum, right? You don't have to convince me very much, right? That's a very easy decision. And for all those people, it's a very easy decision in the opposite direction. And so what we're going to be looking at, man, we're faced with a ton of decisions in our life. Some that are very easy and some that are very taxing and difficult. And my goal is to show us some ways to help what we often would think are hard decisions, help them become easier in our life. And I think we can see that through the story of Pilate. And as we're digging into this story, I got to give us a little bit of history. So if you don't like history, this is not going to be the fun part, but we'll just stick with me for 5 minutes. It's going to help us get a better grasp. We need to understand Rome and some Roman history just briefly. Rome was founded in 753 BC by a guy by the name of Romulus. It's funny because they even all historians attribute just kind of even the Greek mythology that Romulus, he was born of a she-wolf. That's literally in the history books because we don't know nothing different. And so they say, yep, we just attribute the start of Rome to this guy born of some figment of somebody's imagination. So that was the start of Rome, 753, but at that time it was nothing official. There was no real big powers in the land. It was essentially like say, hey, we're going to be just a club of people. We're going to call ourselves Rome, and we're going to be something one day. They didn't become recognized as a republic until 509 BC. 509 BC. That's when other people began to recognize them as something. Right? Because it's one thing if we just said, hey, me and all the people in this room, we're going to declare, hey, we're a new country here. We're the country of Image Church. And like everybody's thinking, all right, you bunch of weirdos. It's another thing when other people begin to recognize them as something. So that's what happened in 509 BC. But from there, it's just very up and down for years. For several centuries, they would gain some land, gain some more people to be a part, and then they would lose people. It would go up and down. The Punic Wars were during this time, and nothing of real significance happened until 45 BC. And this is when Julius Caesar comes on the scene. You're like, this is the first guy I've heard of. So Julius Caesar comes on the scene, and what he did that's most important is he changed the leadership structure to be a dictatorship, which would allow for faster movement and things later. Even though he came to power in 45 BC, he was assassinated 1 year later. And then things really began to start moving in 27 BC when Caesar Augustus came to power. Caesar Augustus was a very strong leader that began to take over the known world. He was emperor from 27 BC to 14 AD, so a very long time in these terms, and they began to take over everything. We're going to find out in just a little bit. Rome reached its peak at about 117 AD. They lasted for centuries after that, but the strongest they ever were, the most land they had in their control, was about 117 AD. But that finds us that the time of Jesus, at about AD 30 to 33, the time of the trial of Jesus, was kind of the middle of their upward ascent. Right, so that's why I want to show you this map now. We'll throw it up there now. This is all the colored parts of the map is everywhere that Rome conquered and was over at some point in their history. This might be hard to see, but man, it's pretty much everywhere around the Mediterranean. They knew if, man, we can conquer kind of this body of water, we can control trade, we can have a lot of power, it'd be easy to get to different places. And at the time of Jesus, this dotted line all the way around is what they controlled. So there's very few places that they didn't control yet. It's a lot going on. But I just wanted to show you why this is important to know kind of at the time of Jesus, that Rome was this force. They were in control of so many people and so much land. You've heard the phrase, all roads lead to Rome, but really all decisions went through Rome. I mean, they controlled everything, and understanding that understands why some things were done the way that they were done, because a lot was going on in this time of Rome. And so they controlled a lot, and they had all the power. So that leads us to now more specifically, let's take it, because Rome just kind of in Italy over here, but with their focus, we're really focused on this small little area over here at the time of Jesus. And so we're introduced to a guy named Pontius Pilate. So I want to share just a few facts about Pontius Pilate with you that will help us get a better understanding before we kind of read some scriptures. So what we know about Pontius Pilate, first, we know that he was Roman born. He was a Roman citizen. That means that he had great allegiance. He had no ties to the Jews, no ties to the land. He wasn't like a tax collector, which was a Jew that grew up that just started working for Rome. It means he's always held allegiance to Rome. Another thing we learned about him is that he is a prefect of Rome, and he was in that role from 26 to 36 AD. A prefect, there's two types of roles. Essentially, he was a governor, but we have prefects and tetrarchs. You're like, I didn't know we were learning all this morning. Me neither. We're getting into it. So he was a prefect. The difference in a prefect and a tetrarch, they both were governors, but a prefect means that this was a person that was assigned to the role, or they were elected into that position. They usually lasted for about 1 to 3 years before they said, hey, we like somebody else better, or you did something wrong, and we're going to put somebody else in place. So this means he's probably pretty good because he did it for about 11 years, 26 to 36. However, a tetrarch, we're going to learn about Herod a little bit later. A tetrarch means you're in that role just because of your last name. Just because of the family that you were born into, you were born into the role. So just a little bit different. Next thing that we know about him is that he typically resided in Caesarea. Caesarea. I'm going to throw up one more map. If you're like, this is your first time, you're like, man, I didn't know this history lesson. It's not normally like this, but I just think it's important that we kind of dig into some of this. So Caesarea on the map is right here, the top of Samaria. He had a palace there. That's normally where he would hang out. But Pilate was in control. He was governor over Syria and Judea, over all of this land here. But at the time of the trial of Jesus, we know that he was in Jerusalem, not where he normally would be. And the reason for that is because he had two primary purposes Pontius Pilate had. He was to control money and power. He was to control money and power. Because that's what the Romans cared about more than anything. They said, hey, man, if we're going to expand quickly and as far as we want to, we need to be in control of money and power. And so any other issues that came up that didn't concern money or power, Pontius Pilate had really nothing to do with it. He says, I really don't care about any other issues. I just care about the ones that deal with money and power. And so because of that, we find Pontius Pilate in this story in Jerusalem because this is the one time a year that everybody would go to Jerusalem for Passover. So he said, man, we have all the Jews congregating into one place. It could very easily, they begin to have just one idea about threatening the power of Rome and begin to think or even culminate ideas to overthrow the government. And so Pilate thought it was very important. He said, no, I need to make sure I can be there to disperse or fizzle out any threats to Roman power. And so that's our history lesson for the morning. Now let's get to the Bible. All right, here's the really good stuff. In Luke chapter 23, we're going to be reading through verses 26 through 25. It's a larger text, but here's what I say all the time. Here's the most important thing that we'll do this morning is read the Word of God. Because what we believe is that the Bible is the inspired Word of God that is living and active today. So I've had a lot of people say, man, I just really want to hear God speak to me. If you want to hear God speak to you, read the Bible. If you want to hear God speak to you out loud, read the Bible out loud. That's how God speaks to us most clearly. There's some other avenues, but this is most clearly how he speaks to us. So starting in verse 6, a little bit before that, you have the Jewish leaders. They've kind of made up charges against Jesus, and they brought him to Pilate because they can't put anybody to death. They can't sentence anyone to death, and said that we need the Roman governor. We need him to do our dirty work. And so they've brought Jesus to Pilate, and that's where we're introduced to the story in verse 6. And when Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he had learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some signs done by him. So he questioned him at some length, but he made no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him, and Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then arraying him in splendid clothing, he sent him back to Pilate, and Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day. For before this, they had been at enmity with one another. Real quick, before we continue in the story, I want to go back to the second map real quick. So Herod and Pilate, they had the same position. They were both governors. Herod was responsible for Galilee and Perea. Pilate was responsible for Samaria and Judea. However, they didn't like each other because they felt like in a power struggle at times, but they both spent their time in Caesarea. However, they both, in this time, because of the threat of the mob of the Jews, they're both in Jerusalem. And why some of this is important is what Pilate found out. He said, man, Jesus lived and grew up in Galilee. If you ever heard the phrase Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus' hometown is right here in Galilee. So Pilate, from the very beginning, he learned this. He said, man, I want to take this difficult decision off my plate, and I want to push it onto somebody else. He said, man, I'm going to send Jesus to Herod and say, hey, you can have this guy. I really don't want anything to do with him. You do with him whatever you want, because he's really your responsibility as a Galilean. And Herod said, you know what? I'm glad you sent him to me, because I'm into magic. I want to see a magic show. I want to see him do something. I got some water. I want him to turn into wine. Like, he was ready for that. Jesus didn't do anything. He didn't say anything, didn't respond. And so he sends him back. But because of this, for some reason, that caused them to become friends in this moment. So now we're going to pick back up in the story. I hope that was a little bit of context. So verse 13. Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people, and said to them, you brought me this man as the one who was misleading the people. And after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving death has been done by him. I will therefore punish and release him. Man, this is a crazy moment, because the Romans had no problems killing people. And you have the Jewish leaders, the people that held the power amongst the people, saying, hey, we bring this guy to you. We just need you to kill him. The Romans had no problem saying, sure, fine, we don't care. We'll just kill anybody. So this is a big moment for Pilate to push back and say, you know what? I don't see anything wrong here. Because in times past, that probably wouldn't have stopped him. So I want to just kind of paint that picture for you so we feel the weightiness of the scene as we continue in verse 16. It says, but they all cried out together, away with this man, and release to us Barabbas. We talked about Barabbas last week, in case you missed it. Verse 19, it says, a man who had been thrown into the prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder. Verse 20, Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, crucify, crucify him. A third time he said to them, why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish and release him. But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified. And their voices prevailed, so Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and for murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. Man, that's a crazy scene that we're sitting in. You see the conflict that Pilate is dealing with. We even learn later in Matthew that his wife even comes in the scene and say, hey, I've had dreams about this guy. Do not have anything to do with this Jesus guy. And you see him wrestling with this difficult decision, what seems like maybe the hardest decision he's ever had to make in this moment. Right, because what he's choosing between is, if he chooses to release Jesus, it's very possible that he loses his job. It's very possible there's a riot, an attempted overthrow of the Roman government. It's possible that he's even killed. But then if he sentences him to death, the other side of it is he just sent an innocent man to death. Not only that, a guy that he has recognized and calls several times through the different accounts, Christ. And he's met with this weighty, this difficult decision. And I think it just shows us a reality. Hey, we must prepare for difficult decisions because they're going to come. Some of you may be in one right now and just really just aching over what to do about this or that, this direction or that direction. And what I think is just a foundation is that, man, if we do better at planning and we work better towards having a focus on God-glorifying decision-making, I think it would alleviate the difficult decisions in your life. It's not going to eliminate the decisions, it's just going to make them much easier to make. And let me show you what I mean. I kind of have this acrostic that we work through that I think is going to be helpful to how to make God-honoring decisions. The first aspect in how to make God-honoring decisions that was not done in this passage, but is to prioritize God's glory. Prioritize God's glory. When it comes to decision-making, there's some things that you prioritize that make a decision easy for you. For example, when it comes to a job, maybe you're deciding on what job to take. For some people, hey, the biggest priority for job is the money. And so if the money's right, or if it's this much more than what I was making, or if it's over this amount, then the job is good, then I can take it. Others care less about that. It's like, man, if I have to work nights or weekend, that job is off the table. And that's the biggest priority. Or maybe the biggest priority is the amount of PTO, paid time off. It's like, man, if I get 5 weeks vacation, I'll work for as little as possible. And so whatever we say, hey, this is the greatest priority, we can often use that as a trump card over everything else. And man, how differently would our lives look if we allowed God's glory and delighting the Lord to be the biggest trump card in our life? If we said, man, we're going to allow that to trump anything and everything else, it's going to really eliminate and make some difficult decisions really easy. If Pilate had decided to do that in this moment, this decision that seems very difficult, right, that there's some very weightiness, things that's going to happen either direction. But if he had made a decision from the beginning of his life to say, no, I'm just going to prioritize God and his glory, the decision would already be made for him. I have to release this man. But the reality is, if he had been prioritizing God's glory in his life, he would have never been faced with this decision because he probably would have never took the position. Right, when he's being offered to be governor of Rome over Judea and Samaria, he could have been looking like, man, the benefits are great. The pay's incredible. It's a position I've wanted my whole life. Everything could have looked so good on paper. Then it's like, there's the teensy-incy little thing is that I'm probably going to have to make some immoral decisions. I'm probably going to have to make some decisions at some point that are not going to glorify the Lord. If he'd have said, man, I'm going to allow that to trump everything else, even though everything else looked good, I'm going to allow that to be my priority, his decision would have been made for him. Let's look at that like in present day. If we say, man, I'm never going to date someone that doesn't know and love Jesus. If we just make that the priority in dating, then whenever we come to someone, even though if they check all other boxes that we want in a person, they don't check that box, then we can say then it's not meant to be. And then it's going to eliminate the decision of then starting to date that person, and now you're 2-3 years down the road and contemplating marriage, and it's like, man, this feels so weighty and difficult. Because this person still doesn't know Jesus, and I don't know what to do with that, but have I wasted all this time, or what do I do going forward? But man, if we started with prioritizing God's glory, we never would have put ourselves in that position. And man, that affects so many areas of our lives. But then there's often things that we could still glorify the Lord in decision A or decision B. I think about this in terms of maybe you're picking between two great jobs, and if one of them's not morally wrong or doesn't specifically go against God, you're like, okay, now what do I do? So if we check the first box, the next step, the cross is going to be plan, but the next step is listen to the right sources. Listen to the right sources. Pilate ends up listening to three different sources, or at least he hears from three different sources. He hears from the angry mob that's yelling to crucify Jesus, which is the largest group. This is culture. This is the people that are around us. This is the people on your social media feed. That's the first voice. The second is Herod, somebody in the same position as him, someone that thinks like him, someone that is just a good friend of him, that's probably just going to say the same thing that he would say. And the last voice that he had is his wife that said vehemently, went against everyone else. These are the three voices that he heard, and yet he chose to go along with the crowds. If you've been walking with Jesus for any amount of time, you know this to be true, is that, doing the right thing and doing the thing that would honor the Lord the most is often not the most popular thing. And yet we must make sure that our focus, that we're listening to the right sources. We can have so many people telling us something different. The second part of it is man, you need to have people in your life that are different than you, that think differently than you, that love Jesus, and that will tell you no. And for some of you, you need someone that maybe you're quick to always say no. Maybe you need someone that knows Jesus, loves you, and cares about you, that needs to give you a nudge at times. Like, for example, some of you are maybe need so much information that you never end up doing anything. And you feel like God's calling you, moving you in a certain direction. You're like, man, I just still don't know if it's clear. And you're like, man, you're like Gideon, and you're going to put a fleece out and say, man, God, I just need you to make it extra clear. And maybe you need that person in your life to give you the nudge of saying, no, here's where you step in faith. And others of you, maybe you just always step to any new thing. You're always looking for something else. And maybe you need that friend to say, hey, no. Maybe we don't do that this time. Maybe we sit and wait. Maybe we stay faithful to the last thing that God's called you to. Or maybe they actually agree with you in what you're doing. But you just need people that are willing and able to say, hey, because I love you, because I care about you, I think a little bit differently on this, and I want to help you. Here's one of the things that I will congratulate Pilate on. One of the things that was very uncommon for this day is to have your spouse to speak into a political decision. This almost would have never happened. Particularly, this is something that probably could have been extremely punishable. There could have been extreme consequences. But this shows us that Pilate had such a relationship with his wife that he said, you know what? I invite you to speak in. Maybe if you see I'm out of step somewhere, help me. Maybe guide me, redirect me. And I'm not saying this needs to be a spouse, but there needs to be people in your life that have permission to correct you when you're wrong. Because we're going to get it wrong. That yell was because my wife was saying that you get it wrong a lot, Ryan. No, we're going to get it wrong. And you know how much easier it is for someone to say, man, because I love you, because I care about you, I want to help you get it right. You know how much easier it is when you say, hey, I want you to do that for me. I don't know about you, that's the most terrifying conversations I've had in my past is when I do that and tell someone, man, hey, where you're at right now, you're kind of out of step with the gospel, and I want better for you. We need to invite that. And it's going to help us make the right decisions. It's going to help maybe alleviate some of the bad decisions we're prone to make. So prioritize God's glory. Listen to the right sources. Third, attain information. One of the things that also I will accommodate or congratulate Pilate for is he began to ask questions. He said, wait, you're a Galilean? Then maybe you need to go talk to somebody else. He said, I want to be informed in this decision. He asked Jesus, hey, did you really say these things? Are you really saying, hey, you're the King of the Jews, that you are this Christ? He said, let me be super clear before I go any further. And the reason I thought this was important, because I don't want you to get kind of like information paralysis. We can definitely go too far in this. But in a world of disinformation, it is really important that we understand the facts. It's important that we can attain or understand as much information as possible to make the most informed decision as possible. I'm not going to spend as much time there, but I think this is just vitally important. The last is never rationalize. Never rationalize. Here's what happens. The word rationalize means to attempt to explain or justify one's own or another's behaviors or attitudes with logical, plausible reasons, even if they're not true or appropriate. I didn't realize how big of a rationalizer I was until I was working on this sermon, because I gave my wife freedom to call me out on it this week. And she don't have that freedom anymore. No, I'm kidding. Because I'm just easy to, I want to rationalize everything and just to make myself look as good as possible. That's what rationalization does. It's like, hey, I'm going to still make the poor decision, but I want to make it look okay. Here's the example in Pilate. I want to show you in Matthew 27:24. It says, so when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves. Right? It's this moment of Pilate saying, hey, this isn't on me anymore. I wash my hands of it. I'm even going to do this weird thing. I'm literally going to wash my hands. I want y'all to see it. So I want y'all to know, hey, this is on you. But ultimately, Pilate still sentenced Jesus to death. No matter all the external forces, he still is the one that did it. I feel like far too often we are quick to rationalize the things that we struggle with, the things that we deal with, the things that are difficult in our lives. It's like, man, we find ourselves on a website we know we shouldn't be on again, but it's like, man, if my wife would treat me better, I wouldn't have to go to this website. We find ourselves gossiping with coworkers again. It's like, man, well, that's all that they talk about. So if I want to be included, if I want to be not looked at as weird, then I have to talk about those things as well. We cheat on our taxes, and we say, man, well, if the government didn't misappropriate funds, then I wouldn't have to. I wouldn't want to cheat on my taxes, or whatever it may be. I feel like we get in dangerous positions whenever we begin to say, you know what we're doing is really not that bad. Or really, it just makes sense because of this. What areas of your life are you rationalizing that you need to maybe for a moment begin to take responsibility for? Because if we want to grow in our decision making and make decisions that would honor the Lord, let's look to do what's right and not rationalize what's gray. We're going to prioritize God's glory, listen to the right sources, attain information, and never rationalize. Because we want to honor the Lord with our choices. And our last point this morning, and I'm going to be brief here, is I want you to know that you can't mess up God's plan. You can't mess up God's plan. Here's what I mean by this. And in John 18, this is still just John's account of this same story. In verse 29, it says, so Pilate went outside to them and said, what accusations do you bring against this man? They answered him, if this man were not doing evil, we would have not delivered him over to you. Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. John gives us this glimpse into the picture that even though Pilate was going to make one of the worst decisions in history to have Jesus murdered, it goes to show that, man, this was part of God's plan all along. The plan to redeem a rebellious people to himself. That's the beautiful picture of Pilate's story. Even though he made one of the greatest mistakes in all of history, even though he rationalized and he didn't listen, all these other things, he said, man, I'm going to die, but I'm also going to die for you, Pilate. All the mistakes you've ever made, even this mess up that you've had, it didn't mess up God's good plan because he loves you so much. That you can't do enough bad, that you can't do enough wrong, you can't mess it up. God said, hey, I love you so much that I died for you on the cross with Jesus. And rose from the grave 3 days later to show his power over death, sin, and the grave, and all of your mistakes, so that we can be reconciled to the Father. So I don't want you to ever think anything in your past is too bad or too big for our Lord. I don't want you to think anything in your future that you're going to mess up, because we're going to. Maybe the greatest mistake you've ever made hasn't even happened yet. And God's good plan, his grace is bigger than that even. And even in the rebellion, even when we don't get this planning thing right, even when we make decisions that don't honor the Lord, Jesus is saying, come to me. He loves you fully and completely. And that's a love and a relationship that you could begin even today. And I'd love to talk with you more about that. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to sing one last song and just invite you in time of response. You can respond in whatever way you see fit. Sing the song, sit there. If you want to come talk with me, pray with me, I'll be in the back. Whatever the Lord leads you to do in this time, we invite you to respond. Will you pray with me?